Do you feel safer now? Or do old wounds still echo sometimes?
They flew my brother first class to Dubai, handed him a trip that looked like something pulled straight from one of those glossy travel magazines, and when I reminded them that only a week earlier I had begged for a little help with rent, they looked at me with the kind of blank, innocent faces that said they had already decided I wasn't worth remembering, and the only words they managed to string together were, "Oh, we forgot." Do you know what that feels like? It isn't just being told no. It isn't even about the money itself. It's about the casual dismissal, the way they shrugged like my life, my stress, my dignity, were so irrelevant that it barely took up space in their minds. I sat there at the table, listening to my mom excitedly talk about how my brother deserved a break, how he worked so hard and needed to see the world, while my dad went on about how they wanted to surprise him with something special, and my brother just grinned, soaking up every bit of praise like it was his birthright. And me? I was still calculating in my head if I could cover next month's rent without pawning something I couldn't afford to lose. I wanted to scream, honestly. I wanted to slam my hands down on that table and ask them how exactly they could forget their own daughter crying on the phone just a week ago, explaining that I was short because my hours got cut and rent doesn't wait for explanations. But I didn't scream, because screaming would have made me look desperate, and if there's one thing I swore a long time ago, it's that I would never give them the satisfaction of watching me beg. Instead, I smiled. I smiled so wide it probably looked fake, and I nodded like the news about my brother's luxury trip was exactly what I'd been hoping to hear, and in that moment I realized something sharp and painful. I wasn't part of their family celebration. I was background noise, someone who existed only when they wanted to feel generous, someone who would always be asked to clap for my brother's wins even as my own struggles were brushed aside. It wasn't just the "we forgot." That phrase cut like a knife, but it was everything behind it that really got me. They didn't forget. Let's be honest, no one forgets their daughter crying into the phone about eviction notices. What they meant was, we chose not to care. And maybe they thought if they said it in a light enough tone, I'd let it slide. And maybe they were right, because I did let it slide, at least outwardly. Inside, though, something shifted. It was the kind of shift you don't announce, you don't explain, you just quietly let it grow until one day it's too big to ignore. I sat there, sipping water, listening to them describe the five-star hotel, the desert safari, the shopping sprees they had lined up for my brother. Every word felt like a jab, not because I wanted those things, but because it was so obvious how far they were willing to go for him, how much they stretched to make him happy, how easily they opened their wallets when it came to his dreams, while I was treated like a nuisance for asking them to cover a fraction of my rent. And as I smiled, nodding along, I thought about all the other times I had been put in this position. Times when I needed something small and was told I should be more independent, while my brother was handed cars, trips, tuition, excuses. And still, they looked me dead in the eye and said they forgot. The room was buzzing with excitement, but in my head there was silence, and in that silence, I made a decision. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to beg again. I wasn't even going to raise my voice. I was just going to leave. And the beauty of leaving is that it doesn't always mean packing up and walking out the door in some dramatic scene. Sometimes leaving starts quietly in your head, the moment you stop expecting people to show up for you, the moment you realize you don't need their approval, their crumbs of affection, or their shallow apologies. I knew I wasn't leaving empty-handed either, though they had no idea. That night, after the excitement calmed down and they were all still caught up in their plans, I replayed the moment in my mind over and over. My mom's gushing tone, my dad's proud smile, my brother's smug face, and the way no one even noticed the silence that came from me. They thought my silence meant I accepted my role, that I was too weak to push back. What they didn't realize was that my silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. When I finally stood up from that table, I didn't announce anything, didn't slam doors or cause a scene. I just smiled, thanked them for dinner, and let them bask in their perfect little family moment. And while they were busy congratulating themselves for being so generous to my brother, I walked out knowing something they didn't. I was already planning my exit, and I was going to take something they never in a million years would expect me to take. And that was the moment everything changed. When people ask me why the Dubai thing hurts so much, I tell them it was never just about a plain seat or a bill with my name on it. It was about the slow drip of a lifetime where my brother's needs were framed as emergencies and mine were framed as lessons. And when I finally held out my hand and said I could use a little help to keep a roof over my head, they didn't just say no. They decorated their no with a smile and a story about how he deserved a first-class adventure because life had been hard for him lately, as if the rest of us were living on a game board where his piece always got the extra turn and the rest of us were supposed to clap. I can trace it back to the kind of moments that look small from a distance, yet stack up into something heavy you carry around without noticing. Like the time in high school when he crashed the car and my dad called it a teachable moment that required a family-funded repair and a fresh insurance policy, because boys make mistakes. While I picked up a second job when my laptop died and nobody offered to help because girls should budget better, or the year he drifted through community college and my mom said he just needed time to find himself, while I worked nights and days and still heard that I was being dramatic whenever I said I was tired. And even then I kept thinking if I proved how capable I was they would meet me halfway. Not with trophies or cash showers, but with the kind of care people give when you are hurting and too proud to say it outright. So when they said they forgot, what I heard was the truth that had been echoing behind every holiday toast and every "you should be proud of your brother" announcement, which is that I existed as the reliable backdrop, the person who showed up, kept things moving, collected the passwords and logins, booked the reservations, reset the routers, balanced the shared subscriptions, fixed the printer, organized the insurance folder, and generally made their lives run while they congratulated themselves for being a close family. And somewhere along the way I started believing that being indispensable meant I was safe, when really it only meant I was invisible until something broke and needed my hands again. I stopped asking that day, not with a grand speech or a dramatic scene, but in the quiet way that changes the ending before anyone else notices the plot has shifted. And I went home and I opened the drawer where I keep all the family admin I somehow acquired over the years, the travel accounts I created to pull points, the shared cloud folders with scans of policies and receipts, the passwords I reset after every holiday because someone forgot again, and I began sorting what was mine by law, what was mine by labor, and what was mine by simple fairness, because if you spend enough time being the responsible one, you start forgetting that responsible people are allowed to draw a line and say this part comes back with me. I remembered that the family airline pool existed because I built it from scratch, that the bulk of those points were accumulated on my spend and my referrals when I chased sign-ups to help us all travel cheaper, that the lounge access they waved around like a perk from the universe was actually attached to a card with my name on it, that the hotel statuses they used to upgrade rooms were earned by nights I paid for on work trips they never asked me about. And I realized I had been gifting them a travel safety net for years while being told to tighten my belt when rent got tight, which hit me as both absurd and clarifying. Because sometimes the only way to feel the shape of your own generosity is to take your hand off the scale and watch what happens without you holding it steady. So I logged in, slowly, carefully, without malice, and without any sense of doing something wrong, and I pulled my points out of the pool because they were mine to withdraw. I removed my access card from the list of lounge users because that was my name and my fee and my benefit. I ended the autofill that sent confirmations to my email because I was tired of being the unpaid concierge. And then I did the part that felt like more than cleanup and less than war, which was opening the shared cloud and downloading copies of the documents I had scanned, the policies I had organized, the list of contacts I had built, and I moved them to a private folder with a plain title that anyone else would miss if they ever went looking. Because while I was not going to destroy anything or lock anyone out, I was absolutely going to stop subsidizing the fantasy that I owed them unlimited access to my time, my work, and the systems I created. Before I logged off, I wrote a short message that said I would be stepping back from family admin, so they should add their own emails for future alerts. I scheduled the subscriptions to roll to their cards at the next renewal. And I signed it with a thank you that was polite and impossible to argue with, and then I drove by my mother's house to return a spare key and a binder she likes to call the family brain, except I didn't return the little envelope tucked in the back sleeve with the safe. Deposit box details and the second key that has my initials on it, because I paid for the box when Dad asked me to open it years ago, and not one person has offered to cover a single year of that fee. And what I took was simply control over the thing I had been trusted to maintain, which is to say I took back my right to decide how and when my work gets used. On the ride home, my phone lit up with my mother's texts asking why the airline pool was suddenly showing fewer points, and why the lounge permissions looked different, and whether something was wrong with the shared folder because she could not find a document she wanted for the trip planning, and I answered with the most honest sentence I have ever sent her, which said that nothing was wrong, everything was finally correct. My pieces were no longer on their board, and if they needed help they could ask my brother, since he had a first-class seat and a head start, and while I waited for the typing bubble that did not come, I pulled the small velvet pouch with the safe box key from my pocket and slid it into my glove compartment, not as a threat or a trophy, but as a reminder that the first step of my plan was done and that the next step would not be announced either, because the best revenge is not a performance, it is a boundary that changes the math, and the math was about to change. 4. Real. The days after I pulled my accounts and my quiet responsibilities away from them looked ordinary to anyone glancing in from the outside, yet for me they were filled with a kind of clarity I had never experienced before. Because instead of waiting for another call about resetting something, booking something, paying something on time because no one else had bothered, I let the silence stretch, and the silence revealed exactly how dependent they had been on me, even while pretending that I was the one who always asked for too much. My brother was already gone by then, posting pictures of poolside cocktails in Dubai, tagged with captions about how hard work pays off, while the only hard work he had ever done was convincing our parents that he deserved endless chances. My mother tried to cover for him, saying travel was educational and would help him grow into himself, as if 30 years of excuses hadn't already proven what kind of man he had chosen to become, and my father chimed in with that tired line about how I was strong enough to manage on my own, which in their language meant, we don't feel like being inconvenienced by your needs, so we'll turn it into a compliment and call it independence. For a while I considered confronting them directly, not because I thought it would change anything but because some part of me wanted to hear my own voice cut through the lies, to say out loud that I was done playing the background character in their family theater. Yet the more I thought about it, the more I realized that raising my voice would only feed their narrative that I was dramatic, unstable, or ungrateful, and the last thing I wanted was to hand them that easy out. So instead of arguing, I chose to observe, and when you start observing without engaging, you begin to notice cracks in the facade that were always there but blurred by noise. My father, for example, liked to act like he was the provider holding everything together, but half of his insurance papers were stored in the very folders I had managed, which meant that if I stopped filing them, he would be lost. My mother liked to act like she had control over the family finances, but her system was nothing more than me, emailing her reminders and keeping lists updated. And my brother, well, he was living on borrowed comfort the entire time, funded by a pool of benefits and points I had orchestrated, which meant the lifestyle he boasted about was never really his own, but he never bothered to think about where it came from, because entitlement doesn't ask questions. It was in that quiet period that I realized the breaking point wasn't going to arrive with shouting or slammed doors, but with choices that looked small from the outside and enormous from the inside. Choices like moving my direct deposit to a new bank and closing the account my parents still had linked for emergencies. Choices like securing the safe deposit box in my name only because I was the one paying for it anyway. Choices like speaking with a lawyer friend of mine about what belonged to me legally if things ever got messy, and with each of those decisions I felt the invisible chains loosen, the ones that had been disguised as loyalty and family duty, but were really dependence they had built around me because I made life easier for them. The moment that really sealed it for me came one evening when my mother called in a panic because she could not access the digital folder with the household bills, and she needed to check something about the property taxes. And instead of fixing it for her like I always had, I calmly said that the folder was no longer mine to manage, that she would have to log in under her own account and request a password reset. And the silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever said to me. Because in that pause I could hear her realizing that I was serious, that I wasn't bluffing this time, that I had finally decided to let her feel the inconvenience she had been shielding my brother from his entire life. I hung up, not cruelly, just firmly, and I remember sitting there afterward with a strange mix of guilt and freedom, because part of me still wanted to rescue her. But the other part knew that if I gave in now I would be erasing everything I had quietly taken back, and the truth was I had already chosen my side, and it wasn't theirs anymore. That night I went through every piece of my life that touched theirs, and I asked myself one question. Does this connection serve me or does it drain me? And every time the answer was drain, I severed it, not angrily but methodically, until all that remained was mine. I stopped being their system, their fixer, their excuse, and I became someone they would have to reckon with, because whether they wanted to admit it or not, I was holding more leverage than they had ever acknowledged, and though I wasn't ready to show my full hand yet, I knew that when I did, the impact would land harder than any argument could have, because they would see that I had been the backbone all along, and without me, their perfect balance would collapse. And that was the real breaking point, not the day they forgot me, but the day I decided to remember myself and act on it, without apology and without asking their permission. Leaving, for me, did not look like packing bags in a hurry or storming out in some dramatic scene that people could gossip about later, because that kind of exit would have satisfied them too much, giving them the narrative that I was unstable, over-emotional, and too fragile to handle life without their guiding hand. So instead, I crafted my departure the way someone builds a case in court, carefully, quietly, and with attention to every detail that had been overlooked for years, and while they were busy planning my brother's next adventure, I was planning the end of my unpaid role as the family's backbone, though I had no intention of announcing it until every piece was firmly in place. I began with my work, because for years they had acted like the company my father had started was his empire alone, forgetting that I was the one who kept the operations running behind the scenes whenever he disappeared into long golf weekends or claimed exhaustion, and though my brother was praised as the future of the family legacy, the truth was he barely understood how the accounts were structured, where the contracts were filed, or even which clients were actually bringing in money, whereas I had been the one responding to late-night emails, drafting proposals, and cleaning up every mess while being told my role was temporary, a kind of training ground until I figured out my own path. What they didn't realize was that in training me to run things temporarily, they had essentially given me full control of every moving piece, and while they forgot I even existed when it came to generosity, they had trusted me with the information that actually mattered: passwords, client lists, vendor agreements, renewal dates, and the kind of data that makes or breaks a business when handled correctly. For years I told myself I was just being responsible, helping out until they saw my value, but after Dubai, I stopped waiting for recognition and started treating what I knew as leverage, not because I planned to harm them, but because I understood. Maybe for the first time, that power is not what people give you, it is what you quietly take back when no one is watching. So I began extracting myself not just emotionally, but structurally, creating backups of every file I had touched, setting up systems in my name where my work was clearly marked as mine, and documenting the endless ways I had kept their world intact. I didn't sabotage anything, because that would have been too easy for them to spin against me, but I took what was legally and rightfully mine: the contacts I had cultivated, the proposals written under my hand, the agreements I had negotiated while they gave the credit elsewhere. If they wanted to believe my brother was the future, then fine, but they would have to face the reality of him trying to run a machine without the manual, because I had decided the manual was coming with me. The first time my father called me to ask where a contract was filed and I answered, calmly, that it was no longer my job to know, I felt a rush of guilt that was immediately replaced by relief, because I realized this was how freedom starts. Not in cutting ties overnight, but in refusing to do the work that props up people who cannot even be bothered to treat you as equal. My mother tried to soften the tension by saying I should be patient, that my brother had always needed more guidance, and I almost laughed out loud, because at that point it was obvious that guidance was their polite word for handouts, and I was done providing those, whether in money, labor, or silence. The final step of my exit was walking into the bank one afternoon and officially transferring the safe deposit box into my name only, because the rental agreement was mine and the payments had always come from my account. Yet, somehow everyone else acted like it was a shared resource, forgetting that the only reason they had access in the first place was because I allowed it, and as I signed the papers confirming that all authority rested with me now, I felt the kind of control that comes not from revenge, but from reclaiming what had been stolen slowly over years in the form of my time, my effort, and my dignity. When I left that bank, I didn't call anyone to announce what I had done, because the power of this kind of exit lies in the surprise, in the moment when they go to reach for something they always assumed would be there and find out it no longer belongs to them. And while I drove home, I realized that for the first time in my life I wasn't scared of what would happen when they noticed, because I had nothing left to lose and everything I carried with me was mine by right. They would see it eventually, and when they did, they would understand that the daughter they dismissed, overlooked, and laughed off had been the one holding the real keys all along, and that was the kind of realization you cannot undo. The kind that leaves a mark far deeper than any argument ever could. I decided that if they were going to treat me like a temporary helper who should be grateful to watch my brother float through life on cushions I had stuffed myself, then the only answer that would ever feel right would be to stop arguing about dignity and start cashing in on the quiet leverage I had earned by doing the unglamorous work for years. So I took the envelope from the safe deposit box that held my originals, the proposals I had written, the signed agreements I had shepherded through, the clauses I had tucked in after one too many reminders that my role was supposedly temporary, clauses that said in plain language that continuity of service would follow the named relationship manager if a client so chose. And since the named relationship manager on almost every contract was me because I was the one who built the trust, the language was less a loophole than a lifeboat I had prepared for the day they pushed me overboard and expected me to swim back for applause. I booked meetings not with noise or drama, but with the same calm I had used to keep everyone else's crises from spilling over, taking the airline miles I had reclaimed and turning them into a couple of quick flights to sit across from the clients who had always called me directly anyway, and I told them the truth in a tone that made room for professionalism and boundaries at the same time, which was that I was leaving the family structure because I could no longer carry a load that went unpaid and unacknowledged, that their contracts contained a choice about who continued to serve them, and that if they preferred to stay with me, I had already formed a new company where their services would be delivered by the same person who had delivered them all along. And if they preferred to remain where they were, I would respect it without hard feelings, because I was done being the person who guilt people into decisions when respect and competence could do the job cleanly. What happened next would look like betrayal from the outside if you were the kind of person who never bothered to ask who did the work, but from the inside it felt like gravity finally acting in the right direction. Because nearly every client read the clause and asked the only question that mattered, which was whether I had the same team and the same brain and the same commitment, and when I said yes, with the added bonus that their costs would be transparent and their calls would no longer be routed through a brother who forgot to follow through, they signed the one-page transition letter I had prepared months earlier on a night when I felt small and decided instead to get ready, and with each signature I watched the story flip. Not out of spite, but because people prefer results over narratives, and I had been the results the whole time. The first call from my father came with that strained politeness he uses when he is balancing anger with the fear that he might need something from me, and he asked whether I had encouraged clients to breach their agreements. And I told him I had done nothing of the kind and that if he would like to read the contracts he signed he could find them in his own files, because I no longer managed his cabinets, and when he sputtered about loyalty I said the line I had practiced for weeks. That loyalty without reciprocity is servitude, and I was no longer in that business. And then I thanked him for the experience and hung up before the part where he would try to make me feel like a thief, because I had taken nothing that did not choose to walk with me. My mother tried a different angle, sending long messages about family, about how my brother was under pressure and how I should be kinder, and I almost replied with a list of pressures I had carried in silence. But I caught myself and answered with one sentence that I knew would land without giving her ammunition, which was that I was willing to be kind while being free, and that if they wanted a relationship with me, they could build it on the same ground rules I offered clients. Meaning, respect, clarity, and zero unpaid labor. And when she asked what I had taken, because she could not shake the feeling that something was missing beyond the clients and the points and the passwords, I told her the truth that tasted better than any revenge I could have scripted, which was that I had taken back the story where I wait for them to choose me. And I had replaced it with a structure where I choose myself and let everyone else opt in or opt out without punishment. On the morning my brother returned from Dubai to discover that the office he bragged about running was quiet and the calendar he assumed would be full was thin, he sent me a message that swung from insult to plea in the space of one paragraph. And I answered with a simple offer that was both generous and uncompromising, which was that I would license the process documents I had written for a fair fee, train whoever he hired to replace me at my hourly rate, and restore his access to the tools I had built once he paid the outstanding reimbursements I had logged for years and never submitted. And while he raged for a while, he eventually forwarded the total to our parents, who finally understood that my exit had not been a tantrum, but an audit that converted invisible labor into value. And the conversation stopped being about whether I was dramatic and started being about numbers spelled out in words that even they could not deny. I did not hold a press conference or savor a grand apology, because the win was not their remorse. It was the quiet correctness of a life that finally fit me, and as I locked the safe deposit box with my documents inside, the originals labeled and the new company seal resting next to them, I felt the clean satisfaction of a plan that had been less about hurting them and more about refusing to let them keep hurting me. And even though the future will probably include awkward holidays and long gaps in conversation and the occasional poke at my boundaries, the core truth is settled in a way that will not shake, which is that I left without begging, I built without permission, and I turned what they dismissed into a map out of the life they expected me to endure. And if there is any question left dangling at the end of the story, it is not whether I went too far, because I did not. It is whether they will ever learn to treat people as more than tools, and that answer is theirs too. Figure out without me while I take my seat, not in first class or last, but exactly where I choose to be.